Chapter 4 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, Enchantments and Desolations. Chapter 4, A Cab Runs in English and Barks in Slang. The following day was the 3rd of June, 1832. A date which it is necessary to indicate on account of the grave events which at that epoch hung on the horizon of Paris in the state of lightning-charged clouds. Marius at nightfall was pursuing the same road as on the preceding evening, with the same thoughts of delight in his heart, when he caught sight of Éponine approaching through the trees of the boulevard. 2 days in succession! This was too much. He turned hastily aside, quitted the boulevard, changed his course, and went to the Rue Plumet through the Rue Monsieur. This caused Éponine to follow him to the Rue Plumet, a thing which she had not yet done. Up to that time she had contented herself with watching him on his passage along the boulevard, without ever seeking to encounter him. It was only on the evening before that she had attempted to address him. So Éponine followed him, without his suspecting the fact. She saw him displace the bar and slip into the garden. She approached the railing, felt the bars one after the other, and readily recognized the one which Marius had moved. She murmured in a low and in gloomy accents, "None of that, Lisette." She seated herself on the underpinning of the railing, close beside the bar as though she were guarding it. It was precisely at the point where the railing touched the neighboring wall. There was a dim nook there, in which Éponine was entirely concealed. She remained thus for more than an hour, without stirring and without breathing, a prey to her thoughts. Towards 10 o'clock in the evening, one of the 2 or 3 persons who passed through the Rue Plumet, an old belated bourgeois, who was making haste to escape from this deserted spot of evil repute, as he skirted the garden railings and reached the angle which it made with the wall, heard a dull and threatening voice saying, "I'm no longer surprised that he comes here every evening." The passer-by cast a glance around him, saw no one, dared not peer into the black niche, and was greatly alarmed. He redoubled his pace. This passer-by had reason to make haste, for a very few instants later, 6 men who were marching separately and at some distance from each other along the wall, and who might have been taken for a grey patrol, entered the Rue Plumet. The first to arrive at the garden railing halted and waited for the others. A second later all 6 reunited. These men began to talk in a low voice. "This is the place," said one of them. "Is there a cab, a dog, in the garden?" asked another. "I don't know. In any case, I have fetched a ball that will make him eat." "Have you some putty to break the pane with?" "Yes." "The railing is old," interpolated a 5th, who had the voice of a ventriloquist. "So much the better," said the second who had spoken. "It won't screech under the saw, and it won't be hard to cut." The 6th, who had not yet opened his lips, now began to inspect the gate, as Éponine had done an hour earlier, grasping each bar in succession and shaking them cautiously. Thus he came to the bar which Marius had loosened. As he was on the point of grasping this bar, a hand emerged abruptly from the darkness, fell upon his arm. He felt himself vigorously thrust aside by a push in the middle of his breast, and a hoarse voice said to him, but not loudly, "There's a dog." At that moment he perceived a pale girl standing before him. The man underwent that shock which the unexpected always brings. He bristled up in hideous wise. Nothing is so formidable to behold as ferocious beasts who are uneasy. Their terrified air evokes terror. He recoiled and stammered, "What jade is this?" "Your daughter." It was in fact Éponine who had addressed Thénardier. At the apparition of Éponine, the other 5, that is to say, Claquesous, Gueulemer, Babet, Brujon, and Montparnasse, had noiselessly drawn near, without precipitation, without uttering a word, with the sinister slowness peculiar to these men of the night. Some indescribable but hideous tools were visible in their hands. Gueulemer held one of those pairs of curved pincers which prowlers call fanchons. "Ah, see here! What are you about there? What do you want with us? Are you crazy?" exclaimed Thénardier, as loudly as one can exclaim and still speak low. "What have you come here to hinder our work for?" Éponine burst out laughing, and threw herself on his neck. "I am here, little father, because I am here. Isn't a person allowed to sit on the stones nowadays? It's you who ought not be here. What have you come here for, since it is a biscuit? I told Magnon so. There's nothing to be done here. But embrace me, my good little father. It's a long time since I've seen you. So you're out?" Thénardier tried to disentangle himself from Éponine's arms and grumbled, "That's good. You've embraced me. Yes, I'm out. I'm not in. Now get away with you." But Éponine did not release her hold, and redoubled her caresses. "But how did you manage it, little pa? You have been very clever to get out of that. Tell me about it. And my mother? Where is mother? Tell me about mamma." Thénardier replied, "She's well, I don't know. Let me alone and be off, I tell you." "I won't go." "So there now," pouted Éponine like a spoiled child. "You send me off, and it's 4 months since I saw you, and I've hardly had time to kiss you." And she caught her father around the neck. "Come now, this is stupid," said Babet. "Make haste," said Gueulemer. "The cops may pass." The ventriloquist's voice repeated his distich. "Nous ne sommes pas le jour de l'an." This isn't New Year's Day. "À bécoter papa, maman, to peck at pa and ma." Éponine turned to the 5 ruffians. "Why, it's Monsieur Brujon! Good day, Monsieur Babet! Good day, Monsieur Cloxou! Don't you know me, Monsieur Gueulemer? How goes it, Montparnasse?" "Yes, they know you," ejaculated Thénardier. "But good day, good evening, sheer off, leave us alone." "It's the hour for foxes, not chickens," said Montparnasse. "You see the job we have on hand here," added Babet. Éponine caught Montparnasse's hand. "Take care," he said. "You'll cut yourself. I've a knife open." "My little Montparnasse," responded Éponine very gently, "you must have confidence in people. I am the daughter of my father, perhaps. Monsieur Babet, Monsieur Gueulemer, I am the person who is charged to investigate this matter." It is remarkable that Éponine did not talk slang. That frightful tongue had become impossible to her since she had known Marius. She pressed in her hand, small, bony, and feeble as that of a skeleton, Gueulemer's huge, coarse fingers, and continued, "You know well that I am no fool. Ordinarily I am believed. I have rendered you service on various occasions. Well, I have made inquiries. You will expose yourselves to no purpose. You see, I swear to you that there is nothing in this house." "There are lone women," said Gueulemer. "No persons have moved away." "The candles haven't, anyway," ejaculated Babet. And he pointed out to Éponine across the tops of the trees a light which was wandering about in the mansard roof of the pavilion. It was Toussaint, who had stayed up to spread out some linen to dry. Éponine made a final effort. "Well," said she, "they're very poor folks, and it's a hovel where there isn't a sou." "Go to the devil!" cried Thénardier. "When we've turned the house upside down and put the cellar at the top and the attic below, we'll tell you what there is inside, and whether it's francs or sous or half-farthings." And he pushed her aside with the intention of entering. "My good friend, Mr. Montparnasse," said Éponine, "I entreat you, you are a good fellow, don't enter." "Take care, you'll cut yourself," replied Montparnasse. Thénardier resumed in his decided tone, "Decamp, my girl, and leave men to their own affairs." Éponine released Montparnasse's hand, which she had grasped again, and said, "So you mean to enter this house?" "Rather," grinned the ventriloquist. Then she set her back against the gate, faced the 6 ruffians who were armed to the teeth, and to whom the night lent the visages of demons, and said in a firm, low voice, "Well, I don't mean that you shall." They halted in amazement. The ventriloquist, however, finished his grin. She went on. "Friends, listen well. This is not what you want. Now I am talking. In the first place, if you enter this garden, if you lay a hand on this gate, I'll scream, I'll beat on the door, I'll rouse everybody, I'll have the whole 6 of you seized, I'll call the police." "She'd do it too," said Thénardier in a low tone to Brujon and the ventriloquist. She shook her head and added, "Beginning with my father." Thénardier stepped near. "Not so close, my good man," said she. He retreated, growling between his teeth, "Why, what's the matter with her?" And he added, "Bitch." She began to laugh in a terrible way. "As you like. But you shall not enter here. I am not the daughter of a dog, since I am the daughter of a wolf. There are 6 of you. What matters that to me? You are men, while I am woman. You don't frighten me. I tell you that you shan't enter this house because it doesn't suit me. If you approach, I'll bark. I told you, I'm the dog, and I don't care a straw for you. Go your way, you bore me. Go where you please, but don't come here. I forbid it. You can use your knives. I'll use kicks. It's all the same to me. Come on." She advanced a pace near the ruffians. She was terrible. She burst out laughing. "Pardine, I am not afraid. I shall be hungry this summer, and I shall be cold this winter. Aren't they ridiculous, these ninnies of men, who think they can scare a girl? What? Scare? Oh, yes, much, because you have finical puppets of mistresses who hide under the bed when you put on a big voice. Forsooth, I ain't afraid of anything, that I ain't." She fastened her intent gaze upon Thénardier and said, "Not even you, father." Then she continued, as she cast her bloodshot, spectre-like eyes upon the ruffians in turn, "What do I care if I'm picked up tomorrow morning on the pavement of the Rue Plumet, killed by the blows of my father's club, or whether I'm found a year from now in the nets at Saint Cloud, or the Isle of Swan, in the midst of rotten old corks and drowned dogs?" She was forced to pause. She was seized by a dry cough. Her breath came from her weak and narrow chest like the death rattle. She resumed, "I have only to cry out, and people will come, and then slap, bang! There are 6 of you. I represent the whole world." Thénardier made a movement towards her. "Don't approach!" she cried. He halted and said gently, "Well, no, I won't approach, but don't speak so loud. So you intend to hinder us in our work, my daughter? But we must earn our living all the same. Have you no longer any kind of feeling for your father?" "You bother me," said Éponine. "We must live, we must eat. Burst!" So saying, she seated herself on the underpinning of the fence and hummed, "Mon bras si dodu, my arm so plump, ma jambe bien faite, my leg well formed, et le temps perdu, and time wasted." She had set her elbow on her knee and her chin in her hand, and she swung her foot with an air of indifference. Her tattered gown permitted a view of her thin shoulder blades. The neighboring street lantern illuminated her profile and her attitude. Nothing more resolute and more surprising could be seen. The 6 rascals, speechless and gloomy at being held in check by a girl, retreated beneath the shadow cast by the lantern, and held counsel with furious and humiliated shrugs. In the meantime, she stared at them with a stern but peaceful air. "There's something the matter with her," said Babet. "A reason. Is she in love with the dog? It's a shame to miss this, anyway. 2 women, an old fellow who lodges in the backyard, and curtains that ain't so bad at the windows. The old cove must be a Jew. I think the job's a good one." "Well, go in, then, the rest of you," exclaimed Montparnasse. "Do the job. I'll stay here with the girl, and if she fails us, He flashed the knife, which he held open in his hand in the light of the lantern. Thénardier said not a word, and seemed ready for whatever the rest pleased. Brujon, who was somewhat of an oracle, and who had, as the reader knows, put up the job, had not as yet spoken. He seemed thoughtful. He had the reputation of not sticking at anything, and it was known that he had plundered a police post simply out of bravado. Besides this, he made verses and songs which gave him great authority. Babet interrogated him. "Say you nothing, Brujon?" Brujon remained silent an instant longer. Then he shook his head in various ways, and finally concluded to speak. "Oh, that's bad. Let's quit." They went away. As they went, Montparnasse muttered, "Never mind. If they had wanted, I'd have cut her throat." Babet responded, "I wouldn't. I don't hit a lady." At the corner of the street they halted and exchanged the following enigmatical dialogue in a low tone. "Where shall we go to sleep tonight?" "Under Patin, Paris." "Have you the key to the gate, Thénardier?" "Pardi." Éponine, who never took her eyes off of them, saw them retreat by the road by which they had come. She rose and began to creep after them along the walls and the houses. She followed them thus as far as the boulevard. There they parted, and she saw these 6 men plunge into the gloom, where they appeared to melt away. End of Book 8, Chapter 4. Chapter 5 and 6 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 8, Enchantments and Desolations. Chapter 5, Things of the Night. After the departure of the ruffians, the Rue Plumet resumed its tranquil nocturnal aspect. That which had just taken place in this street would not have astonished a forest. The lofty trees, the copses, the heaths, the branches rudely interlaced, the tall grass exist in a sombre manner. The savage swarming there catches glimpses of sudden apparitions of the invisible. That which is below man distinguishes, through the mist, that which is beyond man. And the things of which we living beings are ignorant there meet face to face in the night. Nature, bristling and wild, takes alarm at certain approaches in which she fancies that she feels the supernatural. The forces of the gloom know each other and are strangely balanced by each other. Teeth and claws fear what they cannot grasp. Blood-drinking bestiality, voracious appetites, hunger in search of prey, the armed instincts of nails and jaws which have for source and aim the belly, glare and smell out uneasily the impassive spectral forms straying beneath the shroud, erect in its vague and shuddering robe, and which seem to them to live with the dead and terrible life. These brutalities, which are only matter, entertain a confused fear of having to deal with the immense obscurity condensed into an unknown being. A black figure, barring the way, stops the wild beast short. That which emerges from the cemetery intimidates and disconcerts that which emerges from the cave. The ferocious fear the sinister. Wolves recoil when they encounter a ghoul. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Marius becomes practical once more to the extent of giving Cosette his address. While this sort of a dog with a human face was mounting guard over the gate, and while the 6 ruffians were yielding to a girl, Marius was by Cosette's side. Never had the sky been more studded with stars and more charming, the trees more trembling, the odor of the grass more penetrating. Never had the birds fallen asleep among the leaves with a sweeter noise. Never had all the harmonies of universal serenity responded more thoroughly to the inward music of love. Never had Marius been more captivated, more happy, more ecstatic. But he had found Cosette sad. Cosette had been weeping. Her eyes were red. This was the first cloud in that wonderful dream. Marius' first word had been, "What is the matter?" And she had replied, "This." Then she had seated herself on the bench near the steps, and while he tremblingly took his place beside her, she had continued, "My father told me this morning to hold myself in readiness, because he has business, and we may go away from here." Marius shivered from head to foot. When one is at the end of one's life, to die means to go away. When one is at the beginning of it, to go away means to die. For the last 6 weeks, Marius had little by little, slowly by degrees, taken possession of Cosette each day. As we have already explained, in the case of first love, the soul is taken long before the body. Later on, one takes the body long before the soul. Sometimes one does not take the soul at all. The Faublas and the Prudhommes add, because there is none. But the sarcasm is, fortunately, a blasphemy. So Marius possessed Cosette, as spirits possess, but he enveloped her with all his soul, and seized her jealously with incredible conviction. He possessed her smile, her breath, her perfume, the profound radiance of her blue eyes, the sweetness of her skin when he touched her hand, the charming mark which she had on her neck, all her thoughts. Therefore, he possessed all Cosette's dreams. He incessantly gazed at, and he sometimes touched lightly with his breath the short locks on the nape of her neck, and he declared to himself that there was not one of those short hairs which did not belong to him, Marius. He gazed upon and adored the things that she wore, her knot of ribbon, her gloves, her sleeves, her shoes, her cuffs, as sacred objects of which he was the master. He dreamed that he was the lord of those pretty shell combs which she wore in her hair. And he even said to himself, in confused and suppressed stammerings of voluptuousness which did not make their way to the light, that there was not a ribbon of her gown, not a mesh in her stockings, not a fold in her bodice, which was not his. Beside Cosette, he felt himself beside his own property, his own thing, his own despot and his slave. It seemed as though they had so intermingled their souls that it would have been impossible to tell them apart had they wished to take them back again. "This is mine." "No, it is mine." "I assure you that you are mistaken. This is my property." "What you are taking as your own is myself." Marius was something that made a part of Cosette, and Cosette was something which made a part of Marius. Marius felt Cosette within him. To have Cosette, to possess Cosette, this to him was not to be distinguished from breathing. It was in the midst of this faith, of this intoxication, of this virgin possession, unprecedented and absolute, of this sovereignty, that these words, "We are going away," fell suddenly at a blow, and that the harsh voice of reality cried to him, "Cosette is not yours." Marius awoke. For 6 weeks Marius had been living, as we have said, outside of life. Those words, "going away," caused him to re-enter it harshly. He found not a word to say. Cosette merely felt that his hand was very cold. She said to him in her turn, "What is the matter?" He replied in so low a tone that Cosette hardly heard him, "I did not understand what you said." She began again. "This morning my father told me to settle all my little affairs and to hold myself in readiness, that he would give me his linen to put in a trunk, that he was obliged to go on a journey, that we were to go away, that it is necessary to have a large trunk for me and a small one for him, and that all is to be ready in a week from now, and that we might go to England." "But this is outrageous!" exclaimed Marius. It is certain that at that moment no abuse of power, no violence, not one of the abominations of the worst tyrants, no action of Busiris, of Tiberius, or of Henry VIII could have equalled this in atrocity, in the opinion of Marius. Monsieur Fauchelevent taking his daughter off to England because he had business there. He demanded in a weak voice, "When do you start?" He did not say when. "And when shall you return?" He did not say when. Marius rose and said coldly, "Cosette, shall you go?" Cosette turned toward him her beautiful eyes, all filled with anguish, and replied in a sort of bewilderment, "Where?" "To England. Shall you go?" "Why do you say you to me? I ask you whether you will go." "What do you expect me to do?" she said, clasping her hands. "So you will go? If my father goes, so you will go?" Cosette took Marius' hand and pressed it without replying. "Very well," said Marius. "Then I will go elsewhere." Cosette felt rather than understood the meaning of these words. She turned so pale that her face shone white through the gloom. She stammered, "What do you mean?" Marius looked at her, then raised his eyes to heaven and answered, "Nothing." When his eyes fell again, he saw Cosette smiling at him. The smile of a woman whom one loves possesses a visible radiance, even at night. "How silly we are! Marius, I have an idea." "What is it?" "If we go away, do you go too. I will tell you where. Come and join me wherever I am." Marius was now a thoroughly roused man. He had fallen back into reality. He cried to Cosette, "Go away with you? Are you mad? Why, I have to have money, and I have none. Go to England? But I am in debt now. I owe, I don't know how much, more than 10 louis to Courfeyrac, one of my friends with whom you are not acquainted. I have an old hat which is not worth 3 francs. I have a coat which lacks buttons in front. My shirt is all ragged. My elbows are torn. My boots let in water. For the last 6 weeks I have not thought about it, and I have not told you about it. You only see me at night, and you give me your love. If you were to see me in the daytime, you would give me a sou. Go to England? Ah! I haven't enough money to pay for a passport." He threw himself against a tree which was close at hand, erect, his brow pressed close to the bark, feeling neither the wood which flayed his skin nor the fever which was throbbing in his temples. And there he stood motionless, on the point of falling, like the statue of despair. He remained a long time thus. One could remain for eternity in such abysses. At last he turned around. He heard behind him a faint stifled noise, which was sweet yet sad. It was Cosette sobbing. She had been weeping for more than 2 hours beside Marius as he meditated. He came to her, fell at her knees, and slowly prostrating himself, he took the tip of her foot, which peeped out from beneath her robe, and kissed it. She let him have his way in silence. There are moments when a woman accepts, like a sombre and resigned goddess, the religion of love. "Do not weep," he said. She murmured, "Not when I may be going away, and you cannot come." He went on, "Do you love me?" She replied, sobbing, by that word from paradise, which is never more charming than amid tears, "I adore you." Marius resumed. He continued in a tone which was an indescribable caress, "Do not weep. Tell me, will you do this for me, and cease to weep?" "Do you love me?" said she. He took her hand. "Cosette, I have never given my word of honor to anyone, because my word of honor terrifies me. I feel that my father is by my side. Well, I give you my most sacred word of honor, that if you go away, I shall die." In the tone with which he uttered these words there lay a melancholy so solemn and so tranquil that Cosette trembled. She felt that chill which is produced by a true and gloomy thing as it passes by. The shock made her cease weeping. "Now listen," said he. "Do not expect me tomorrow." "Why?" "Do not expect me until the day after tomorrow." "Oh, why?" "You will see. A day without seeing you? But that is impossible. Let us sacrifice one day in order to gain our whole lives, perhaps. And Marius added in a low tone and in an aside, he is a man who never changes his habits, and he has never received any one except in the evening. Of what man are you speaking? Asked Cosette. I said nothing. What do you hope, then? Wait until the day after tomorrow. You wish it? Yes, Cosette. She took his hand in both her hands, raising herself on tiptoe in order to be on a level with him, and tried to read his hope in his eyes. Marius resumed. Now that I think of it, you ought to know my address. Something might happen. One never knows. I live with that friend named Courfeyrac, Rue de la Verrerie, number 16. He searched in his pocket, pulled out his penknife, and with the blade he wrote on the plaster of the wall, 16 Rue de la Verrerie. In the meantime, Cosette had begun to gaze into his eyes once more. Tell me your thought, Marius. You have some idea. Tell it to me. Oh, tell me, so I may pass a pleasant night. This is my idea, that it is impossible that God should mean to part us. Wait. Expect me the day after tomorrow. What shall I do until then? Said Cosette. You are outside. You go and come. How happy men are. I shall remain entirely alone. Oh, how sad I shall be. What is it that you are going to do tomorrow evening? Tell me. I am going to try something. Then I will pray to God, and I will think of you here so that you may be successful. I will question you no further, since you do not wish it. You are my master. I shall pass the evening tomorrow in singing that music from Euryanthe that you love, and that you came one evening to listen to outside my shutters. But day after tomorrow you will come early. I shall expect you at dusk, at 9 o'clock precisely. I warn you, mon Dieu, how sad it is that these days are so long. On the stroke of 9, do you understand? I shall be in the garden. And I also. And without having uttered it, moved by the same thought, impelled by those electric currents which place lovers in continual communication, both being intoxicated with delight even in their sorrow, they fell into each other's arms, without perceiving that their lips met, while their uplifted eyes, overflowing with rapture and full of tears, gazed upon the stars. When Marius went forth, the street was deserted. This was the moment when Éponine was following the ruffians to the boulevard. While Marius had been dreaming with his head pressed to the tree, an idea had crossed his mind, an idea, alas, that he himself judged to be senseless and impossible. He had come to a desperate decision. End of Book 8, Chapters 5 and 6.
Chapter 7 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Elizabeth Florence Hapgood, Book 8, Enchantments and Desolations. Chapter 7, The Old Heart and the Young Heart, in the presence of each other. At that epoch, Father Gillenormand was well past his 91st birthday. He still lived with Mademoiselle Gillenormand in the Rue des Filles du Calvaire, numero 6, in the old house which he owned. He was, as the reader will remember, one of those antique old men who await death perfectly erect, whom age bears down without bending, and whom even sorrow cannot curve. Still, his daughter had been saying for some time, "My father is sinking." He no longer boxed the maid's ears. He no longer thumped the landing place so vigorously with his cane when Basque was slow in opening the door. The Revolution of July had exasperated him for the space of barely 6 months. He had viewed almost tranquilly that coupling of words in the Moniteur, Monsieur Humboldt, Comte, Peer of France. The fact is that the old man was deeply dejected. He did not bend. He did not yield. this was no more a characteristic of his physical than of his moral nature. But he felt himself giving way internally. For 4 years he had been waiting for Marius, with his foot firmly planted, that is the exact word, in the conviction that that good-for-nothing young scamp would ring at his door some day or other. Now he had reached the point where, at certain gloomy hours, he said to himself that if Marius made him wait much longer, it was not death that was insupportable to him. It was the idea that perhaps he should never see Marius again. The idea of never seeing Marius again had never entered his brain until that day. Now the thought began to recur to him, and it chilled him. Absence, as is always the case in genuine and natural sentiments, had only served to augment the grandfather's love for the ungrateful child, who had gone off like a flash. It is during December nights, when the cold stands at 10 degrees, that one thinks oftenest of the sun. M. Gillenormand was, or thought himself above all things, incapable of taking a single step, he, the grandfather, towards his grandson. "I would die rather," he said to himself. He did not consider himself as the least to blame, but he thought of Marius only with profound tenderness and the mute despair of an elderly, kindly old man who is about to vanish in the dark. He began to lose his teeth, which added to his sadness. M. Gillenormand, without, however, acknowledging it to himself, for it would have rendered him furious and ashamed, had never loved a mistress as he loved Marius. He had had placed in his chamber, opposite the head of his bed, so that it should be the first thing on which his eyes fell on waking, an old portrait of his other daughter, who was dead, Madame Pontmercy, a portrait which had been taken when she was 18. He gazed incessantly at that portrait. One day he happened to say, as he gazed upon it, "I think the likeness is strong." "To my sister?" inquired Mademoiselle Gillenormand. "Yes, certainly." The old man added, "And to him also." Once, as he sat with his knees pressed together and his eyes almost closed, in a despondent attitude, his daughter ventured to say to him, "Father, are you as angry with him as ever?" She paused, not daring to proceed further. "With whom?" he demanded. "With that poor Marius." He raised his aged head, laid his withered and emaciated fist on the table, and exclaimed in his most irritated and vibrant tone:— "Poor Marius, do you say? That gentleman is a knave, a wretched scoundrel, a vain little ingrate, a heartless, soulless, haughty, and wicked man." And he turned away so that his daughter might not see the tear that stood in his eye. 3 days later he broke a silence which had lasted 4 hours to say to his daughter point-blank, "I had the honor to ask Mademoiselle Gillenormand never to mention him to me." Aunt Gillenormand renounced every effort and pronounced this acute diagnosis: "My father never cared very much for my sister after her folly. It is clear that he detests Marius." After her folly meant after she had married the colonel. However, as the reader has been able to conjecture, Mademoiselle Gillenormand had failed in her attempt to substitute her favorite, the officer of lancers, for Marius. The substitute, Théodule, had not been a success. M. Gillenormand had not accepted the quid pro quo. A vacancy in the heart does not accommodate itself to a stopgap. Théodule, on his side, though he scented the inheritance, was disgusted at the task of pleasing. The good man bored the lancer, and the lancer shocked the good man. Lieutenant Théodule was gay, no doubt, but a chatterbox, frivolous but vulgar, a high liver, but a frequenter of bad company. He had mistresses, it is true, and he had a great deal to say about them, it is true also, but he talked badly. All his good qualities had a defect. Monsieur Gillenormand was worn out with hearing him tell about the love affairs that he had in the vicinity of the barracks in the Rue de Babylone. And then Lieutenant Gillenormand sometimes came in his uniform with the tricolored cockade. This rendered him downright intolerable. Finally, Father Gillenormand had said to his daughter, "I've had enough of that Théodule. I haven't much taste for warriors in time of peace. Receive him if you choose. I don't know, but I prefer slashers to fellows that drag their swords. The clash of blades in battle is less dismal, after all, than the clank of the scabbard on the pavement. And then throwing out your chest like a bully and lacing yourself like a girl with stays under your cuirass is doubly ridiculous. When one is a veritable man, one holds equally aloof from swagger and from affected airs. He is neither a blusterer nor a finicky-hearted man. Keep your Théodule for yourself." It was in vain that his daughter said to him, "But he is your grandnephew, nevertheless." It turned out that Monsieur Gillenormand, who was a grandfather to the very fingertips, was not in the least a grand uncle. In fact, as he had good sense, and as he had compared the two, Théodule had only served to make him regret Marius all the more. One evening, it was the 24th of June, which did not prevent Father Gillenormand having a rousing fire on the hearth. He had dismissed his daughter, who was sewing in a neighboring apartment. He was alone in his chamber amidst its pastoral scenes, with his feet propped on the andirons, half enveloped in his huge screen of Coromandel lacquer, with its 9 leaves, with his elbow resting on a table where burned 2 candles under a green shade, engulfed in his tapestry armchair, and in his hand a book which he was not reading. He was dressed according to his wont like an incroyable, and resembled an antique portrait by Goddard. This would have made people run after him in the street had not his daughter covered him up whenever he went out in a vast bishop's wadded cloak, which concealed his attire. At home he never wore a dressing gown, except when he rose and retired. "It gives one a look of age," said he. Father Gillenormand was thinking of Marius lovingly and bitterly, and, as usual, bitterness predominated. His tenderness, once soured, always ended by boiling and turning to indignation. He had reached the point where a man tries to make up his mind and to accept that which rends his heart. He was explaining to himself that there was no longer any reason why Marius should return, that if he intended to return, he should have done it long ago, that he must renounce the idea. He was trying to accustom himself to the thought that all was over, that he should die without having beheld that gentleman again. But his whole nature revolted. His aged paternity would not consent to this. "Well," said he, this was his doleful refrain, "he will not return." His bald head had fallen upon his breast, and he fixed a melancholy and irritated gaze upon the ashes on his hearth. In the very midst of his reverie, his old servant Basque entered and inquired, "Can monsieur receive Monsieur Marius?" The old man sat up erect, pallid, and like a corpse which rises under the influence of a galvanic shock. All his blood had retreated to his heart. He stammered, "Monsieur Marius what?" "I don't know," replied Basque, intimidated and put out of countenance by his master's air. "I have not seen him. Nicolette came in and said to me, 'There's a young man here, say that it is Monsieur Marius.'" Father Gillenormand stammered in a low voice, "Show him in." And he remained in the same attitude, with shaking head and his eyes fixed on the door. It opened once more. A young man entered. It was Marius. Marius halted at the door, as though waiting to be bidden to enter. His almost squalid attire was not perceptible in the obscurity caused by the shade. Nothing could be seen but his calm, grave, and strangely sad face. It was several minutes before Father Gillenormand, dulled with amazement and joy, could see anything except a brightness, as when one is in the presence of an apparition. He was on the point of swooning. He saw Marius through a dazzling light. It was certainly he. It certainly was Marius. At last, after the lapse of 4 years, he grasped him entire, so to speak, in a single glance. He found him noble, handsome, distinguished, well-grown, a complete man, with a suitable mien and a charming air. He felt a desire to open his arms, to call him, to fling himself forward. His heart melted with rapture. Affectionate words swelled and overflowed his breast. At length all his tenderness came to the light and reached his lips, and by a contrast which constituted the very foundation of his nature, what came forth was harshness. He said abruptly, "What have you come here for?" Marius replied with embarrassment, "Monsieur." Monsieur Gillenormand would have liked to have Marius throw himself into his arms. He was displeased with Marius and with himself. He was conscious that he was brusque and that Marius was cold. It caused the good man unendurable and irritating anxiety to feel so tender and forlorn within, and only to be able to be hard outside. Bitterness returned. He interrupted Marius in a peevish tone. "Then why did you come?" That "then" signified, "if you do not come to embrace me." Marius looked at his grandfather, whose pallor gave him a face of marble. "Monsieur, have you come to beg my pardon? Do you acknowledge your faults?" He thought he was putting Marius on the right road, and that the child would yield. Marius shivered. It was the denial of his father that was required of him. He dropped his eyes and replied, "No, sir." "Then," exclaimed the old man impetuously, with a grief that was poignant and full of wrath, "what do you want of me?" Marius clasped his hands, advanced a step, and said in a feeble and trembling voice, "Sir, have pity on me." These words touched M. Gillenormand. Uttered a little sooner, they would have rendered him tender, but they came too late. The grandfather rose. He supported himself with both hands on his cane. His lips were white, his brow wavered, but his lofty form towered above Marius as he bowed. "Pity on you, sir. It is youth demanding pity of the old man of 91. You are entering into life. I am leaving it. You go to the play, to balls, to the café, to the billiard hall. You have wit. You please the women. You are a handsome fellow. As for me, I spit on my brands in the heart of summer. You are rich with the only riches that are really such. I possess all the poverty of age, infirmity, isolation. You have your 32 teeth, a good digestion, bright eyes, strength, appetite, health, gaiety, a forest of black hair. I have no longer even white hair. I have lost my teeth. I am losing my legs. I am losing my memory. There are 3 names of streets that I confound incessantly, the Rue Charlotte, the Rue de Chaume, and the Rue Saint-Claude. That is what I have come to. You have before you the whole future full of sunshine, and I am beginning to lose my sight. So far am I advanced into the night.
You are in love, that is a matter of course. I am beloved by no one in all the world, and you ask pity of me? Parbleu, Molière forgot that. If that is the way you jest in the courthouse, messieurs the lawyers, I sincerely compliment you. You are droll."
And the octogenarian went on in a grave and angry voice.
"Come now, what do you want of me?"
"Sir," said Marius, "I know that my presence is displeasing to you, but I have come merely to ask one thing of you, and then I shall go away immediately."
"You are a fool," said the old man. "Who said that you were to go away?"
This was the translation of the tender words which lay at the bottom of his heart. "Ask my pardon. Throw yourself on my neck." M. Gillenormand felt that Marius would leave him in a few moments, that his harsh reception had repelled the lad, that his hardness was driving him away. He said all this to himself, and it augmented his grief, and as his grief was straightway converted into wrath, it increased his harshness. He would have liked to have had Marius understand, and Marius did not understand, which made the good man furious. He began again.
"What? You deserted me, your grandfather? You left my house to go no one knows whither, you drove your aunt to despair, you went off, it is easily guessed, to lead a bachelor life. It's more convenient to play the dandy, to come in at all hours, to amuse yourself. You have given me no signs of life, you have contracted debts without even telling me to pay them, you have become a smasher of windows and a blusterer, and at the end of 4 years you come to me, and that is all you have to say to me."
This violent fashion of driving a grandson to tenderness was productive only of silence on the part of Marius. M. Gillenormand folded his arms, a gesture which with him was peculiarly imperious, and apostrophized Marius bitterly.
"Let us make an end of this. You have come to ask something of me, you say? Well, what? What is it? Speak."
"Sir," said Marius, with a look of a man who feels that he is falling over a precipice, "I have come to ask your permission to marry." M. Gillenormand rang the bell. Basque opened the door halfway.
"Call my daughter."
A second later, the door was opened once more. Mademoiselle Gillenormand did not enter, but showed herself. Marius was standing mute, with pendant arms and a face of a criminal. M. Gillenormand was pacing back and forth in the room. He turned to his daughter and said to her, "Nothing. It is Monsieur Marius. Say good day to him. Monsieur wishes to marry. That is all. Go away." The curt, hoarse sound of the old man's voice announced a strange degree of excitement. The aunt gazed at Marius with a frightened air, hardly appeared to recognize him, did not allow a gesture or a syllable to escape her, and disappeared at her father's breath, more swiftly than a straw before the hurricane. In the meantime, Father Gillenormand had returned and placed his back against the chimney-piece once more. "You marry at 21? You have arranged that? You have only a permission to ask, a formality. Sit down, sir. Well, you have had a revolution since I had the honor to see you last. The Jacobins got the upper hand. You must have been delighted. Are you not a Republican since you are a baron? You can make that agree. The Republic makes a good sauce for the barony. Are you one of those decorated by July? Have you taken the Louvre at all, sir? Quite near here, in the Rue Saint-Antoine, opposite the Rue des Normandières, there is a cannonball encrusted in the wall of the 3rd story of a house, with this inscription, July 28th, 1830. Go, take a look at that. It produces a good effect. Ah, those friends of yours do pretty things. By the way, aren't they erecting a fountain in the place of the monument
of Monsieur le Duc de Berry. So, you want to marry. Whom? Can one inquire without indiscretion? He paused, and before Marius had time to answer, he added violently, "Come now! You have a profession, a fortune made? How much do you earn at your trade of lawyer?" "Nothing," said Marius, with a sort of firmness and resolution that was almost fierce. "Nothing? Then all you have to live upon is the 1,200 livres that I allow you?" Marius did not reply. Monsieur Gillenormand continued, "Then I understand the girl is rich?" "As rich as I am." "What? No dowry?" "No." "Expectations?" "I think not." "Utterly naked. What's the father?" "I don't know." "And what's her name?" "Mademoiselle Fauchelevent." "Fauche what?" "Fauchelevent." "Pfft!" ejaculated the old gentleman. "Sir!" exclaimed Marius. Monsieur Gillenormand interrupted him with the tone of a man who is speaking to himself. "That's right, 21 years, no profession, 1,200 livres a year. Madame la Baronne de Pontmercy will go and purchase a couple of sous worth of parsley from the fruitière." "Sir," repeated Marius in the despair of the last hope, which was vanishing, "I entreat you, I conjure you in the name of heaven, with clasped hands, sir, I throw myself at your feet. Permit me to marry her." The old man burst into a shout of strident and mournful laughter, coughing and laughing at the same time. You said to yourself, "Pardine, I'll go hunt up that old blockhead, that absurd numbskull. What a shame that I'm not 25, how I'd treat him to a nice, respectful summons. How nicely I'd get along without him. It's nothing to me. I'd say to him, 'You're only too happy to see me, you old idiot. I want to marry. I desire to wed Mademoiselle no matter whom, daughter of Monsieur no matter what. I have no shoes, she has no chemise. That just suits. I want to throw my career, my future, my youth, my life to the dogs. I wish to take a plunge into wretchedness with a woman around my neck. That's an idea, and you must consent to it. And the old fossil will consent. Go, my lad, do as you like. Attach your paving stone. Marry your pousse-à-l'ivant, your coupe-à-l'ivant. Never, sir, never."
"Father!"
"Never!"
At the tone in which that never was uttered, Marius lost all hope. He traversed the chamber with slow steps, with bowed head, tottering and more like a dying man than like one merely taking his departure. Monsieur Gillenormand followed him with his eyes, and at the moment when the door opened and Marius was on the point of going out, he advanced 4 paces with the senile vivacity of impetuous and spoiled old gentlemen, seized Marius by the collar, brought him back energetically into the room, flung him into an armchair, and said to him, "Tell me all about it." It was that single word, "father," which had effected this revolution. Marius stared at him in bewilderment. Monsieur Gillenormand's mobile face was no longer expressive of anything but rough and ineffable good nature. The grandsire had given way before the grandfather. "Come, see here, speak. Tell me about your love affairs. Jabber, tell me everything. Sapristi, how stupid young folks are." "Father," repeated Marius. The old man's entire countenance lighted up with indescribable radiance. "Yes, that's right. Call me father, and you'll see." There was now something so kind, so gentle, so open-hearted, and so paternal in this brusqueness, that Marius, in the sudden transition from discouragement to hope, was stunned and intoxicated by it, as it were. He was seated near the table. The light from the candles brought out the dilapidation of his costume, which Father Gillenormand regarded with amazement. "Well, father," said Marius. "Ah,
By the way, interrupted Monsieur Gillenormand, you really have not a penny, then? You are dressed like a pickpocket. He rummaged in a drawer, drew forth a purse, which he laid on the table. Here are 100 louis. Buy yourself a hat.
Father, pursued Marius, my good father, if you only knew, I love her. You cannot imagine it. The first time I saw her was at the Luxembourg. She came there. In the beginning, I did not pay much heed to her, and then, I don't know how it came about, I fell in love with her. Oh, how unhappy that made me. Now, at last, I see her every day, at her own home. Her father does not know it. Just fancy, they are going away. It is in the garden that we meet, in the evening. Her father means to take her to England. Then I said to myself, I'll go and see my grandfather and tell him all about the affair. I should go mad first. I should die. I should fall ill. I should throw myself into the water. I absolutely must marry her, since I should go mad otherwise. This is the whole truth, and I do not think that I have omitted anything. She lives in a garden with an iron fence in the Rue Plumet. It is in the neighborhood of the Invalides. Father Gillenormand had seated himself with a beaming countenance beside Marius. As he listened to him and drank in the sound of his voice, he enjoyed at the same time a protracted pinch of snuff. At the words Rue Plumet, he interrupted his inhalation and allowed the remainder of his snuff to fall upon his knees.
The Rue Plumet, did you say? Let us see. Are there not barracks in that vicinity? But why, yes, that's it. Your cousin, Théodule, has spoken to me about it. The lancer, the officer, a gay girl, my good friend, a gay girl. Pardieu, yes. The Rue Plumet. It is what used to be called the Rue Plumet. It all comes back to me now. I have heard of that little girl, of the iron railing in the Rue Plumet, in a garden. Pamela, your taste is not bad. She is said to be a very tidy creature. Between ourselves, I think that simpleton of a lancer has been courting her a bit. I don't know where he did it. However, that's not to the purpose. Besides, he is not to be believed. He brags, Marius. I think it quite proper that a young man like you should be in love. It's the right thing at your age. I like you better as a lover than a Jacobin. I like you better in love with a petticoat, sapristi, with 20 petticoats, than with Monsieur de Robespierre. For my part, I will do myself the justice to say that in the line of sans-culotte, I have never loved anyone but women. Pretty girls are pretty girls, the deuce. There's no objection to that. As for the little one, she receives you without her father's knowledge. Well, that's in the established order of things. I have had adventures of that same sort myself, more than one. Do you know what is done then? One does not take the matter ferociously. One does not precipitate himself into the tragic. One does not make one's mind to marriage and Monsieur le Maire with his scarf. One simply behaves like a fellow of spirit. One shows good sense. Slip along, mortals. Don't marry. You come and look up your grandfather, who is a good-natured fellow at bottom, and who always has a few rolls of louis in an old drawer. You say to him, "See here, grandfather," and the grandfather says, "That's a simple matter. Youth must amuse itself, and old age must wear out. I have been young, you will be old. Come, my boy, you shall pass it on to your grandson. Here are 200 pistoles. Amuse yourself. Deuce take it, nothing better. That's the way the affair should be treated. You don't marry, but that does no harm. You understand me?"
Marius, petrified and incapable of uttering a syllable, made a sign with his head that he did not. The old man burst out laughing, winked his aged eye, gave him a slap on the knee, stared him full in the face with a mysterious and beaming air, and said to him with the tenderest of shrugs of the shoulder,
"Ah, booby! Make her your mistress!"
Marius turned pale.
He had understood nothing of what his grandfather had just said. This twaddle about the Rue Plumet, Pamela, the barracks, the Lancer, had passed before Marius like a dissolving view. Nothing of all that could bear any reference to Cosette, who was a lily. The good man was wandering in his mind, but this wandering terminated in words which Marius did understand, and which were a mortal insult to Cosette. Those words, "Make her your mistress," entered the heart of the strict young man like a sword. He rose, picked up his hat which lay on the floor, and walked to the door with a firm, assured step. There he turned round, bowed deeply to his grandfather, raised his head erect again, and said, "5 years ago you insulted my father. Today you have insulted my wife. I ask nothing more of you, sir. Farewell." Father Gillenormand, utterly confounded, opened his mouth, extended his arms, tried to rise, and before he could utter a word, the door closed once more, and Marius had disappeared. The old man remained for several minutes motionless, and as though struck by lightning, without the power to speak or breathe, as though a clenched fist grasped his throat. At last he tore himself from his armchair, ran, so far as a man can run at 91, to the door, opened it, and cried, "Help! Help!" His daughter made her appearance, then the domestics. He began again with a pitiful rattle. "Run after him! Bring him back! What have I done to him? He is mad! He is going away! Ah, my God! Ah, my God! This time he will not come back." He went to the window which looked out on the street, threw it open with his aged and palsied hands, leaned out more than halfway, while Basque and Nicolette held him behind and shouted, "Marius! Marius! Marius! Marius!" But Marius could no longer hear him, for at that moment he was turning the corner of the Rue Saint-Louis. The octogenarian raised his hands to his temples 2 or 3 times with an expression of anguish, recoiled tottering, and fell back into the armchair, pulseless, voiceless, tearless, with quivering head and lips which moved with a stupid air, with nothing in his eyes and nothing any longer in his heart except a gloomy and profound something which resembled night. End of Book 8, Chapter 7. Chapters 1 to 3 of Book 9 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Elizabeth Florence Hapgood. Book 9, Whither Are They Going? Chapters 1 to 3. Chapter 1, Jean Valjean. That same day, towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jean Valjean was sitting alone on the back side of one of the most solitary slopes in the Champ de Mars. Either from prudence or from a desire to meditate, or simply in consequence of one of those insensible changes of habit which gradually introduce themselves into the existence of everyone, he now rarely went out with Cosette. He had on his workman's waistcoat and trousers of gray linen, and his long-visored cap concealed his countenance. He was calm and happy now beside Cosette. That which had for a time alarmed and troubled him had been dissipated. But for the last week or two anxieties of another nature had come up. One day, while walking on the boulevard, he had caught sight of Thénardier. Thanks to his disguise, Thénardier had not recognized him. But since that day, Jean Valjean had seen him repeatedly, and he was now certain that Thénardier was prowling about in their neighborhood. This had been sufficient to make him come to a decision. Moreover, Paris was not tranquil. Political troubles presented this inconvenient feature for anyone who had anything to conceal in his life, that the police had grown very uneasy and very suspicious, and that while seeking to ferret out a man like Pépin or Maury, they might very readily discover a man like Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean had made up his mind to quit Paris and even France,
and go over to England. He had warned Cosette. He wished to set out before the end of the week. He had seated himself on the slope in the Champs-de-Mars, turning over all sorts of thoughts in his mind. Thénardier, the police, the journey, and the difficulty of procuring a passport. He was troubled from all these points of view. Last of all, an inexplicable circumstance, which had just attracted his attention and from which he had not yet recovered, had added to his state of alarm. On the morning of that very day, when he alone of the household was stirring, while strolling in the garden before Cosette's shutters were open, he had suddenly perceived on the wall the following line engraved, probably with a nail: 16 Rue de la Verrerie. This was perfectly fresh. The grooves in the ancient black mortar were white. A tuft of nettles at the foot of the wall was powdered with a fine, fresh plaster. This had probably been written on the preceding night. What was this? A signal for others, a warning for himself? In any case, it was evident that the garden had been violated and that strangers had made their way into it. He recalled the odd incidents which had already alarmed the household. His mind was now filled with this canvas. He took good care not to speak to Cosette of the line written on the wall, for fear of alarming her. In the midst of his preoccupations, he perceived from a shadow cast by the sun that someone had halted on the crest of the slope immediately behind him. He was on the point of turning round when a paper folded in four fell upon his knees as though a hand had dropped it over his head. He took the paper, unfolded it, and read these words written in large characters with a pencil: "Move away from your house." Jean Valjean sprang hastily to his feet. There was no one on the slope. He gazed all around him and perceived a creature larger than a child, not so large as a man, clad in a gray blouse and trousers of dust-colored cotton velvet, who was jumping over the parapet and who slipped into the moat of the Champs-de-Mars. Jean Valjean returned home at once in a very thoughtful mood. Chapter 2. Marius. Marius had left M. Gillenormand in despair. He had entered the house with very little hope, and quitted it with immense despair. However, and those who have observed the depths of the human heart will understand this, the officer, the lancer, the ninny, Cousin Théodule, had left no trace in his mind, not the slightest. The dramatic poet might apparently expect some complications from this revelation made point blank by the grandfather to the grandson, but what the drama would gain thereby, truth would lose. Marius was at an age when one believes nothing in the line of evil. Later on comes the age when one believes everything. Suspicions are nothing else than wrinkles. Early youth has none of them. That which overwhelmed Othello glides innocuous over Candide. Suspect Cosette? There are hosts of crimes which Marius could sooner have committed. He began to wander about the streets, the resource of those who suffer. He thought of nothing so far as he could afterwards remember. At 2 o'clock in the morning he returned to Courfeyrac's quarters and flung himself, without undressing, on his mattress. The sun was shining brightly when he sank into that frightful leaden slumber which permits ideas to go and come in the brain. When he awoke, he saw Courfeyrac, Enjolras, Feuillet, and Combeferre standing in the room with their hats on and all ready to go out. Courfeyrac said to him, "Are you coming to General Lamarque's funeral?" It seemed to him that Courfeyrac was speaking Chinese. He went out some time after them. He put in his pocket the pistols which Javert had given him at the time of the adventure on the 3rd of February, and which had remained in his hands. These pistols were still loaded. It would be difficult to say what vague thought he had in his mind when he took them with him. All day long he prowled about without knowing where he was going. It rained at times. He did not perceive it. For his dinner, he purchased a penny roll at a baker's, put it in his pocket, and forgot it. It appears that he took a bath in the Seine without being aware of it. There are moments when a man has a furnace within his skull. Marius was passing through one of those moments. He no longer hoped for anything, this step he had taken since the preceding evening. He waited for night with feverish impatience. He had but one idea clearly before his mind. This was that at 9 o'clock he should see Cosette. This last happiness now constituted his whole future. After that, gloom. At intervals, as he roamed through the most deserted boulevards, it seemed to him that he heard strange noises in Paris. He thrust his head out of his reverie and said, "Is there fighting on hand?" At nightfall, at 9 o'clock precisely, as he had promised Cosette, he was in the Rue Plumet. When he approached the grating, he forgot everything. It was 48 hours since he had seen Cosette. He was about to behold her once more. Every other thought was effaced, and he felt only a profound and unheard-of joy. Those minutes in which one lives centuries always have this sovereign and wonderful property, that at the moment when they are passing, they fill the heart completely. Marius displaced the bar and rushed headlong into the garden. Cosette was not at the spot where she ordinarily waited for him. He traversed the thicket and approached the recess near the flight of steps. "She is waiting for me there," said he. Cosette was not there. He raised his eyes and saw that the shutters of the house were closed. He made the tour of the garden. The garden was deserted. Then he returned to the house and, rendered senseless by love, intoxicated, terrified, exasperated with grief and uneasiness, like a master who returns home at an evil hour, he tapped on the shutters. He knocked and knocked again, at the risk of seeing the window open and her father's gloomy face make its appearance and demand, "What do you want?" This was nothing in comparison with what he dimly caught a glimpse of. When he had rapped, he lifted up his voice and called, "Cosette! Cosette!" he cried. "Cosette!" he repeated imperiously. There was no reply. All was over. No one in the garden, no one in the house. Marius fixed his despairing eyes on that dismal house, which was as black and silent as a tomb, and far more empty. He gazed at the stone seat on which he had passed so many adorable hours with Cosette. Then he seated himself on the flight of steps, his heart filled with sweetness and resolution. He blessed his love in the depths of his thought, and he said to himself that, since Cosette was gone, all that there was left for him was to die. All at once he heard a voice which seemed to proceed from the street, and which was calling to him through the trees. "Mr. Marius!" He started to his feet. "Hey?" said he. "Mr. Marius, are you there?" "Yes." "Mr. Marius," went on the voice, "your friends are waiting for you at the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie." This voice was not wholly unfamiliar to him. It resembled the hoarse, rough voice of Éponine. Marius hastened to the gate, thrust aside the movable bar, passed his head through the aperture, and saw someone who appeared to him to be a young man disappearing at the run into the gloom. Chapter 3. Monsieur Mabeuf. Jean Valjean's purse was of no use to Monsieur Mabeuf. Monsieur Mabeuf, in his venerable infantile austerity, had not accepted the gift of the stars. He had not admitted that a star could coin itself into louis d'or. He had not divined that what had fallen from heaven had come from Gavroche. He had taken the purse to the police commissioner of the quartier, as a lost article placed by the finder at the disposal of claimants. The purse was actually lost. It is unnecessary to say that no one claimed it, and that it did not succor Monsieur Mabeuf. Moreover, Monsieur Mabeuf had continued his downward course. His experiments on indigo had been no more successful in the Jardin des Plantes than in his garden at Austerlitz. The year before, he had owed his housekeeper's wages. Now, as we have seen, he owed 3/4 of his rent. The pawnshop had sold the plates of his Flora after the expiration of 13 months. Some coppersmith had made stewpans of them. His copper plates gone, and being unable to complete even the incomplete copies of his Flora which were in his possession, he had disposed of the text at a miserable price as waste paper to a second-hand bookseller. Nothing now remained to him of his life's work. He set to work to eat up the money for these copies. When he saw that this wretched resource was becoming exhausted, he gave up his garden and allowed it to run to waste. Before this, a long time before, he had given up his 2 eggs and the morsel of beef which he ate from time to time. He dined on bread and potatoes. He had sold the last of his furniture, then all duplicates of his bedding, his clothing, and his blankets, then his herbariums and prints, but he still retained his most precious books, many of which were of the greatest rarity. Among others, Les Quatrains historiques de la Bible, edition of 1560, La Concordance des Bibles by Pierre de Besse, Les Marguerites de la Marguerite of Jean de la Haye, with a dedication to the Queen of Navarre, the Book de la Charge et Dignité de l'Ambassadeur by le Sieur de Villehotman, a Florilegium Rabbinicum of 1644, a Tibullus of 1567 with this magnificent inscription, Venitus in Oedipus Manutianus, and lastly a Diogenes Laertius printed at Lyons in 1644, which contained the famous variant of the manuscript 411, 13th century of the Vatican, and those of the 2 manuscripts of Venice, 393 and 394, consulted with such fruitful results by Henri Estienne, and all the passages in Doric dialect which are only found in the celebrated manuscript of the 12th century belonging to the Naples library. Monsieur Mabeuf never had any fire in his chamber, and went to bed at sundown in order not to consume any candles. It seemed as though he had no longer any neighbors. People avoided him when he went out. He perceived the fact. The wretchedness of a child interests a mother. The wretchedness of a young man interests a young girl. The wretchedness of an old man interests no one. It is of all distresses the coldest. Still, Father Mabeuf had not entirely lost his childlike serenity. His eyes acquired some vivacity when they rested on his books, and he smiled when he gazed at the Diogenes Laertius, which was a unique copy. His bookcase with glass doors was the only piece of furniture which he has kept beyond what was strictly indispensable. One day Mother Plutarque said to him, "I have no money to buy any dinner." What she called dinner was a loaf of bread and 4 or 5 potatoes. "On credit," suggested Monsieur Mabeuf. "You know very well that people refuse me." Monsieur Mabeuf opened his bookcase, took a long look at all his books, one after another, as a father obliged to decimate his children would gaze upon them before making a choice, then seized one hastily, put it under his arm, and went out. He returned 2 hours later without anything under his arm, laid 30 sous upon the table, and said, "You will get something for dinner." From that moment forth, Mother Plutarque saw a sombre veil, which was never more lifted, descend over the old man's candid face. On the following day, on the day after, and on the day after that, it had to be done again. Monsieur Mabeuf went out with a book and returned with a coin. As the second-hand dealers perceived that he was forced to sell, they purchased of him for 20 sous that for which he had paid 20 francs, sometimes at those very shops. Volume by volume, the whole library went the same road. He said at times, "But I am 80," as though he cherished some secret hope that he should arrive at the end of his days before reaching the end of his books. His melancholy increased. Once, however, he had a pleasure. He had gone out with a Robert Estienne, which he had sold for 35 sous under the Quai Malaquais,
and he returned with an Aldus, which he had bought for 40 sous in the Rue des Gris. "I owe 5 sous," he said, beaming on Mother Plutarque. That day he had no dinner. He belonged to the Horticultural Society. His destitution became known there. The president of the society came to see him, promised to speak to the Minister of Agriculture and Commerce about him, and did so. "Why, what?" exclaimed the minister. "I should think so. An old savant, a botanist, an inoffensive man. Something must be done for him." On the following day, Monsieur Mabeuf received an invitation to dine with the minister. Trembling with joy, he showed the letter to Mother Plutarque. "We are saved," said he. On the day appointed, he went to the minister's house. He perceived that his ragged cravat, his long square coat, and his waxed shoes astonished the ushers. No one spoke to him, not even the minister. About 10 o'clock in the evening, while he was still waiting for a word, he heard the minister's wife, a beautiful woman in a low-necked gown, whom he had not ventured to approach, inquire, "Who is that old gentleman?" He returned home on foot at midnight, in a driving rainstorm. He had sold an Elzevir to pay for a carriage in which to go thither. He had acquired the habit of reading a few pages in his Diogenes Laertius every night before he went to bed. He knew enough Greek to enjoy the peculiarities of the text which he owned. He had now no other enjoyment. Several weeks passed. All at once, Mother Plutarque fell ill. There is one thing sadder than having no money with which to buy bread at the baker's, and that is having no money to purchase drugs at the apothecary's. One evening, the doctor had ordered a very expensive potion, and the malady was growing worse. A nurse was required. Monsieur Mabeuf opened his bookcase. There was nothing there. The last volume had taken its departure. All that was left to him was Diogenes Laertius. He put this unique copy under his arm and went out. It was the 4th of June, 1832. He went to the Porte Saint-Jacques, to Royal's successor, and returned with 100 francs. He laid the pile of 5-franc pieces on the old serving woman's nightstand, and returned to his chamber without saying a word. On the following morning, at dawn, he seated himself on the overturned post in his garden, and he could be seen over the top of the hedge, sitting the whole morning motionless, with drooping head, his eyes vaguely fixed on the withered flower beds. It rained at intervals. The old man did not seem to perceive the fact. In the afternoon, extraordinary noises broke out in Paris. They resembled shots and the clamors of the multitude. Father Mabeuf raised his head. He saw a gardener passing and inquired, "What is it?" The gardener, spade on back, replied in the most unconcerned tone, "It's the riots." "What riots?" "Yes, they are fighting." "Why are they fighting?" "Ah, good heavens!" ejaculated the gardener. "In what direction?" went on Monsieur Mabeuf. "In the neighborhood of the arsenal." Father Mabeuf went to his room, took his hat mechanically, sought for a book to place under his arm, found none, said, "Ah, truly," and went off with a bewildered air. End of Book 9, Chapters 1 to 3.
Chapter 1 of Book 10 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 10, the 5th of June, 1832. Chapter 1. The surface of the question. Of what is revolt composed? Of nothing and of everything. Of an electricity disengaged little by little, of a flame suddenly darting forth, of a wandering force, of a passing breath. This breath encounters heads which speak, brains which dream, souls which suffer, passions which burn, wretchedness which howls, and bears them away. Whither? At random? Athwart the state? the laws, athwart prosperity and the insolence of others, irritated convictions, embittered enthusiasms, agitated indignations, instincts of war which have been repressed, youthful courage which has been exalted, generous blindness, curiosity, the taste for change, the thirst for the unexpected, the sentiment which causes one to take pleasure in reading the posters for the new play, and love, the prompter's whistle at the theatre, the vague hatreds, rancours, disappointments, every vanity which thinks that destiny has bankrupted it, discomfort, empty dreams, ambitions that are hedged about, whoever hopes for a downfall, some outcome, in short, at the very bottom, the rabble, that mud which catches fire, such are the elements of revolt, that which is grandest and that which is basest, the beings who prowl outside of all bounds, awaiting an occasion, bohemians, vagrants, vagabonds of the crossroads, those who sleep at night in a desert of houses with no other roof than the cold clouds of heaven, those who, each day, demand their bread from chance and not from toil, the unknown of poverty and nothingness, the bare-armed, the bare-footed, belong to revolt. Whoever cherishes in his soul a secret revolt against any deed whatever on the part of the state, of life or of fate, is ripe for riot, and as soon as it makes its appearance he begins to quiver, and to feel himself borne away with the whirlwind. Revolt is a sort of water-spout in the social atmosphere which forms suddenly in certain conditions of temperature, and which, as it eddies about, mounts, descends, thunders, tears, raises, crushes, demolishes, uproots, bearing with it great natures and small, the strong man and the feeble mind, the tree trunk and the stalk of straw. Woe to him whom it bears away, as well as to him whom it strikes. It breaks the one against the other. It communicates to those whom it seizes an indescribable and extraordinary power. It fills the first comer with the force of events. It converts everything into projectiles. It makes a cannonball of a rough stone and a general of a porter. If we are to believe certain oracles of crafty political views, a little revolt is desirable from the point of view of power. System, revolt strengthens those governments which it does not overthrow. It puts the army to the test. It consecrates the bourgeoisie. It draws out the muscles of the police. It demonstrates the force of the social framework. It is an exercise in gymnastics. It is almost hygiene. Power is in better health after a revolt, as a man is after a good rubbing down. Revolt, 30 years ago, was regarded from still other points of view. There is for everything a theory which proclaims itself good sense. Philintus against Alcestis. Mediation offered between the false and the true. Explanation, admonition, rather haughty extenuation which, because it is mingled with blame and excuse, thinks itself wisdom, and is often only pedantry. A whole political school called the golden mean has become the outcome of this. As between cold water and hot water, it is the lukewarm water party. This school with its false depth, all on the surface, which dissects effects without going back to first causes, chides from its height of a demi-science the agitation of the public square. If we listen to this school, the riots which complicated the affair of 1830 deprived that great event of a portion of its purity. The Revolution of July had been a fine popular gale, abruptly followed by blue sky. They made the cloudy sky reappear. They caused that revolution, at first so remarkable for its unanimity, to degenerate into a quarrel. In the Revolution of July, as in all progress accomplished by fits and starts, there had been secret fractures. These riots rendered them perceptible. It might have been said, this is broken. After the Revolution of July, one was sensible only of deliverance. After the riots, one was conscious of a catastrophe. All revolt closes the shops, depresses the funds, throws the exchange into consternation, suspends commerce, clogs business, precipitates failures. No more money, private fortunes rendered uneasy, public credit shaken, industry disconcerted, capital withdrawing, work at a discount, fear everywhere, counter-shocks in every town, hence gulfs. It has been calculated that the first day of a riot cost France 20 millions, the second day 40, the third 60, a 3 days uprising cost 120 millions. That is to say, if only the financial result be taken into consideration, it is equivalent to a disaster, a shipwreck or a lost battle which should annihilate a fleet of 60 ships of the line. No doubt, historically, uprisings have their beauty. The War of the Pavements is no less grandiose and no less pathetic than the War of Thickets. In the one there is the soul of forests, in the other the heart of cities. The one has Jean Chouin, the other has a Jean. Revolts have illuminated with a red glare all the most original points of the Parisian character, Generosity, devotion, stormy gaiety, students proving that bravery forms part of intelligence, the National Guard invincible, bivouacs of shopkeepers, fortresses of street urchins, contempt of death on the part of passers-by, schools and legions clashed together. After all, between the combatants, there was only a difference of age. The race is the same. It is the same stoical men who died at the age of 20 for their ideas, at 40 for their families. The army, always a sad thing in civil wars, opposed prudence to audacity. Uprisings, while proving popular intrepidity, also educated the courage of the bourgeois. This is well, but is all this worth the bloodshed? And to the bloodshed add the future darkness, progress compromised, uneasiness among the best men, honest liberals in despair, foreign absolutism happy in these wounds dealt to revolution by its own hand, the vanquished of 1830 triumphing and saying, "We told you so." Add Paris enlarged, possibly, but France most assuredly diminished. Add, for all must needs be told, the massacres which have too often dishonoured the victory of order grown ferocious over liberty gone mad. To sum up all, uprisings have been disastrous. Thus speaks that approximation to wisdom with which the bourgeoisie, that approximation to the people, so willingly contents itself. For our part, we reject this word uprisings as too large, and consequently as too convenient. We make a distinction between one popular movement and another popular movement. We do not inquire whether an uprising costs as much as a battle. Why a battle in the first place? Here the question of war comes up. Is war less of a scourge than an uprising is of a calamity? And then, are all uprisings calamities? And what if the revolt of July did cost 120 millions? The establishment of Philip V in Spain cost France 2 milliards. Even at the same price, we should prefer the 14th of July. However, we reject these figures, which appear to be reasons and which are only words. An uprising being given, we examine it by itself. In all that is said by the doctrinarian objection above presented, there is no question of anything but effect. We seek the cause. We will be explicit. End of Book 10, Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Book 10 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 10, the 5th of June, 1832. Chapter 2, The Root of the Matter. There is such a thing as an uprising, and there is such a thing as insurrection. These are two separate phases of wrath. One is in the wrong, the other is in the right. In democratic states, the only ones which are founded on justice, it sometimes happens that the fraction usurps. Then the whole rises, and the necessary claim of its rights may proceed as far as resort to arms. In all questions which result from collective sovereignty, the war of the whole against the fraction is insurrection. The attack of the fraction against the whole is revolt. According as the Tuileries contain a king or the convention, they are justly or unjustly attacked. The same cannon, pointed against the populace, is wrong on the 10th of August and right on the 14th of Vendemiaire. Alike in appearance, fundamentally different in reality, the Swiss defend the false, Bonaparte defends the true. That which universal suffrage has effected in its liberty and in its sovereignty cannot be undone by the street. It is the same in things pertaining purely to civilization. The instinct of the masses, clear-sighted today, may be troubled tomorrow. The same fury legitimate when directed against Terray and absurd when directed against Turgot. The destruction of machines, the pillage of warehouses, the breaking of rails, the demolition of docks, the false roots of multitudes, the refusal by the people of justice to progress, Remus assassinated by students, Rousseau driven out of Switzerland and stoned, that is revolt. Israel against Moses, Athens against Phocion, Rome against Cicero, that is an uprising. Paris against the Bastille, that is insurrection. The soldiers against Alexander, the sailors against Christopher Columbus. This is the same revolt, impious revolt. Why? Because Alexander is doing for Asia with the sword that which Christopher Columbus is doing for America with the compass. Alexander, like Columbus, is finding a world. These gifts of a world to civilization are such augmentations of light that all resistance in that case is culpable. Sometimes the populace counterfeits fidelity to itself. The masses are traitors to the people. Is there, for example, anything stranger than that long and bloody protest of dealers in contraband salt, a legitimate chronic revolt, which at the decisive moment, on the day of salvation, at the very hour of popular victory, espouses the throne, turns into chouannerie, and, from having been an insurrection against, becomes an uprising for somber masterpieces of ignorance? The contraband salt dealer escapes the royal gibbets, and with a rope's end round his neck mounts the white cockade. Death to the salt duties brings forth, "Long live the king!" The assassins of St. Barthélemy, the cutthroats of September, the manslaughterers of Avignon, the assassins of Coligny, the assassins of Madame Lamballe, the assassins of Brune, Michelet, Verdets, Cadenets, the companions of Jehu, the chevaliers of Brossard, behold an uprising. La Vendée is a grand Catholic uprising. The sound of right in movement is recognizable. It does not always proceed from the trembling of excited masses. There are mad rages, there are cracked bells. All tocsins do not give out the sound of bronze. The brawl of passions and ignorances is quite another thing from the shock of progress. Show me in what direction you are going. Rise, if you will, but let it be that you may grow great. There is no insurrection except in a forward direction. Any other sort of rising is bad. Every violent step towards the rear is a revolt. To retreat is to commit a deed of violence against the human race. Insurrection is a fit of rage on the part of truth. The pavements which the uprising disturbs give forth the spark of right. These pavements bequeath to the uprising only their mud. Danton against Louis XIV is insurrection. Hébert against Danton is revolt. Hence it results that if insurrection in given cases may be, as Lafayette says, the most holy of duties, an uprising may be the most fatal of crimes. There is also a difference in the intensity of heat. Insurrection is often a volcano. Revolt is often only a fire of straw. Revolt, as we have said, is sometimes found among those in power. Polignac is a rioter. Camille Desmoulins is one of the governing powers. Insurrection is sometimes resurrection. The solution of everything by universal suffrage being an absolutely modern fact, and all history anterior to this fact being, for the space of 4,000 years, filled with violated right, and the suffering of peoples, each epoch of history brings with it that protest of which it is capable. Under the Caesars there was no insurrection, but there was juvenile. The facit indignatio replaces the Gracchi. Under the Caesars there is the exile to Syene. There is also the man of the Annales. We do not speak of the immense exile of Patmos, who, on his part also, overwhelms the real world with a protest in the name of the ideal world, who makes of his vision an enormous satire and casts on Rome Nineveh, on Rome Babylon, on Rome Sodom, the flaming reflection of the apocalypse. John on his rock is the Sphinx on its pedestal. We may understand him, he is a Jew, and it is Hebrew, but the man who writes the Annales is of the Latin race. Let us rather say he is a Roman. As the Neros reign in a black way, they should be painted to match. The work of the graving tool alone would be too pale. There must be poured into the channel a concentrated prose which bites. Despots count for something in the question of philosophers. A word that is chained is a terrible word. The writer doubles and trebles his style when silence is imposed on a nation by its master. From this silence there arises a certain mysterious plenitude which filters into thought and there congeals into bronze. The compression of history produces conciseness in the historian. The granite solidity of such and such a celebrated prose is nothing but the accumulation effected by the tyrant. Tyranny constrains the writer to conditions of diameter which are augmentations of force. The Ciceronian period, which hardly sufficed for Verus, would be blunted on Caligula. The less spread of sail in the phrase, the more intensity in the blow. Tacitus thinks with all his might. The honesty of a great heart, condensed in justice and truth, overwhelms as with lightning. Be it remarked in passing that Tacitus is not historically superposed upon Caesar. The Tiberi were reserved for him. Caesar and Tacitus are two successive phenomena, a meeting between whom seems to be mysteriously avoided by the one who, when he sets the centuries on the stage, regulates the entrances and the exits. Caesar is great, Tacitus is great. God spares these two greatnesses by not allowing them to clash with one another. The guardian of justice, in striking Caesar, might strike too hard and be unjust. God does not will it. The great wars of Africa and Spain, the pirates of Sicily destroyed, civilization introduced into Gaul, into Brittany, into Germany, all this glory covers the Rubicon. There is here a sort of delicacy of the divine justice, hesitating to let loose upon the illustrious usurper, the formidable historian, sparing Caesar, Tacitus, and according extenuating circumstances to genius. Certainly, despotism remains despotism, even under the despot of genius. There is corruption under all illustrious tyrants, but the moral pest is still more hideous under infamous tyrants. In such reigns, nothing veils the shame, and those who make examples, Tacitus as well as Juvenal, slap this ignominy which cannot reply in the face more usefully in the presence of all humanity. Rome smells worse under Vitellius than under Sylla. Under Claudius and under Domitian, there is a deformity of baseness corresponding to the repulsiveness of the tyrant. The villainy of slaves is a direct product of the despot. A miasma exhales from these cowering consciences wherein the master is reflected. Public powers are unclean, hearts are small, consciences are dull, souls are like vermin. Thus it is under Caracalla, thus it is under Commodus, thus it is under Heliogabalus, while from the Roman Senate under Caesar there comes nothing but the odor of the dung which is peculiar to the Ares of the eagles. Hence the advent, apparently tardy, of the Tacituses and the Juvenals. It is in the hour for evidence that the demonstrator makes his appearance. But Juvenal and Tacitus, like Isaiah in biblical times, like Dante in the Middle Ages, is man. Riot and insurrection are the multitude, which is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. In the majority of cases, riot proceeds from a material fact. Insurrection is always a moral phenomenon. Riot is Masaniello, insurrection Spartacus. Insurrection borders on mind, riot on the stomach. Gaster grows irritated, but Gaster assuredly is not always in the wrong. In questions of famine, riot, Buzanque, for example, holds a true, pathetic, and just point of departure. Nevertheless, it remains a riot. Why? It is because, right at bottom, it was wrong in form. Shy although in the right, violent although strong, it struck at random. It walked like a blind elephant. It left behind it the corpses of old men, of women, and of children. It wished the blood of inoffensive and innocent persons without knowing why. The nourishment of the people is a good object. To massacre them is a bad means. All armed protest, even the most legitimate, even that of the 10th of August, even that of July 14th, begin with the same troubles. Before the right gets set free, there is foam and tumult. In the beginning, the insurrection is a riot, just as a river is a torrent. Ordinarily, it ends in that ocean, revolution. Sometimes, however, coming from those lofty mountains which dominate the moral horizon, justice, wisdom, reason, right, formed of the pure snow of the ideal, after a long fall from rock to rock, after having reflected the sky in its transparency and increased by 100 affluents in the majestic mien of triumph, insurrection is suddenly lost in some quagmire, as the Rhine is in a swamp. All this is of the past. The future is another thing. Universal suffrage has this admirable property that it dissolves riot in its inception, and by giving the vote to insurrection, it deprives it of its arms. The disappearance of wars, of street wars as well as of wars on the frontiers, such is the inevitable progression. Whatever today may be, tomorrow will be peace. However, insurrection, riot, and points of difference between the former and the latter, the bourgeois, properly speaking, knows nothing of such shades. In his mind, all is sedition, rebellion pure and simple, the revolt of the dog against his master, an attempt to bite whom must be punished by the chain and the kennel, barking, snapping, until such day as the head of the dog, suddenly enlarged, is outlined vaguely in the gloom face to face with the lion. Then the bourgeois shouts, "Long live the people!" This explanation given, what does the movement of June 1832 signify so far as history is concerned? Is it a revolt? Is it an insurrection? It may happen to us, in placing this formidable event on the stage, to say revolt now and then, but merely to distinguish superficial facts and always preserving the distinction between revolt, the form, and insurrection, the foundation. This movement of 1832 had, in its rapid outbreak and in its melancholy extinction, so much grandeur that even those who see in it only an uprising never refer to it otherwise than with respect. For them, it is like a relic of 1830. Excited imaginations, say they, are not to be calmed in a day. A revolution cannot be cut off short. It must needs undergo some undulations before it returns to a state of rest, like a mountain sinking into the plain. There are no Alps without their Jura, nor Pyrenees without the Asturias. This pathetic crisis of contemporary history, which the memory of Parisians calls the epoch of the riots, is certainly a characteristic hour amid the stormy hours of this century. A last word before we enter on the recital. The facts which we are about to relate belong to that dramatic and living reality which the historian sometimes neglects for lack of time and space. There, nevertheless, we insist upon it, is life, palpitation, human tremor. Petty details, as we think we have already said, are, so to speak, the foliage of great events, and are lost in the distance of history. The epoch, surnamed of the riots, abounds in details of this nature. Judicial inquiries have not revealed, and perhaps have not sounded the depths, for another reason than history. We shall therefore bring to light, among the known and published peculiarities, things which have not heretofore been known, about facts over which have passed the forgetfulness of some, and the death of others. The majority of the actors in these gigantic scenes have disappeared, beginning with the very next day they held their peace, but of what we shall relate, we shall be able to say, "We have seen this." We alter a few names, for history relates and does not inform against, but the deed which we shall paint will be genuine. In accordance with the conditions of the book which we are now writing, we shall show only one side and one episode, and certainly the least known at that, of the 2 days, the 5th and the 6th of June 1832, but we shall do it in such wise that the reader may catch a glimpse, beneath the gloomy veil which we are about to lift, of the real form of this frightful public adventure. End of Book 10, Chapter 2.